Morning, everyone. As usual, gonna take a moment, let folks wander in. And if you're watching this, you have made it all the way to the end. This is the last class of the semester. I'm gonna close that door behind me because it is washing me out. Nah, never mind. It's better with that light on. Okay. Cat on the floor. Slides to where were we? Sorry about that, folks. I swear I don't have the Rona, but I have had the worst spring allergy season in my life, right in the middle of a major upper respiratory pandemic. So, that's been tons of fun, being sneezing and coughing in places. And people are all terrified. It's tons of fun. Alright, well, it's been a couple minutes and nobody seems to be showing up, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the final lecture of Political Science 101. Went a little over time. I don't normally plan to do, obviously, normally when this class is delivered on ground, I have this Thursday set aside for the final exam. So we're a little behind schedule, but most of the time these classes only get 2 Nevada lectures, and there's enough Nevada for 3 lectures. So let's talk about Nevada and diversity. Actually, before we do that, quick course reminders. The final exam, speaking of the final exam, will be available starting at the end of this lecture. Starting at the end of this lecture, the final exam will be available. It will be available through Sunday night at midnight. So if you're watching this on tape delay, it should already be open. Make sure that you get it done this weekend. Grades are due on Wednesday, so I'll have everything done by then. I'm going to end up doing just a ton of grading over this weekend. I'm not looking forward to it. And if you do see me looking down at my phone, my little brother's in the hospital, so I'm kind of dealing with that. So that's a thing. But I'll hopefully deal with that more later. Anyway, so yeah, final exam for y'all. Final exam is starts today, due Sunday night, and that is the end of the course, and you're all done. I still haven't looked over exam 2 scores, and I know I need to. I know I need to look over exam 2 scores. But that was all going to be done over the course of the next several days. Hopefully, if you did have any problem, honestly, attendance, I'm gonna figure all that out as well. Again, if you logged into Canvas weekly, you should be fine. And yeah, I got a lot of work to do between now and Wednesday. But between now and Wednesday, the class will get graded, totaled up, and taken care of. So you will know where you stand by Wednesday. I promise that. And beyond that, thank you all. Good morning, Kimberly. But beyond that, thank you all for choosing to spend the last 16 weeks with me. And, hopefully it was edifying and at least a little entertaining. I do try. Um, let's finish up with the very last lecture of the course, Civil Rights and Elections in Nevada. So, Nevada was once known as the Mississippi of the West, and that's not a compliment. Apologies to anyone from Mississippi. Article 2 of our Constitution restricts the vote to white men, and also bars any black person, mulatto, Indian, or Chinese from giving testimony in court. And so we also saw laws against miscegenation, meaning against interracial relationships, and widespread private discrimination continuing throughout the state all the way up through the 1980s. Las Vegas was segregated, not officially, not legally, but practically. So we'll look at the experience of various communities throughout Nevada's history. Remember, just as with the federal stuff, these experiences were, morning Kathleen, these experiences were interrelated. They were all going on simultaneously. They're a lot more complicated than just, oh, well, here's the Native Americans, oh, well, here's the blacks, oh, here's the Latinos. But obviously, I am very, very much out of time to teach you this stuff, so we're going to do that. Starting with Native Americans. I've already mentioned before that contact between Native Americans and settlers in Nevada was relatively brutal. We talked about the Pyramid Lake War, where at first at first the Washoe kind of held their own, but later the settlers went and got the army and slaughtered all of them. And I mention it not because it was unique, but because it was exemplary, right? It was a good example of what was happening at the time. There were a lot of instances where, for one perceived slight or another, the U.S. Army was called out on a bunch of Native Americans and they got slaughtered. I also talked about how Nevada's reservation system was especially unappealing because, we're talking about the shitty parts of Nevada. The shitty parts of southern Idaho, right? The shitty parts of eastern Oregon, which are already, let's be honest, not the most fertile regions of America. So, non-Native Americans did not go to the reservations. Don't think that was without conflict or contest, right? I'm sure the U.S. Army tried very hard to get them to go to those reservations. We also saw, beyond just the general awfulness of westward expansion and contact, we saw a widespread apparatus of legal discrimination in the state that backed up a kind of second-class citizenship for Native Americans. So Native Americans were barred from purchasing either alcohol or firearms. They weren't allowed to marry or associate with white people, which, when your Indian colony mostly lives off of, white settlements, that can get very awkward very fast. Also, by the way, remember those reservations that are the terrible parts of some terrible parts of the country? Yeah, the state of Nevada sold off the best parts of that land to other white settlers and gave the Native Americans the worst parts of the worst parts of some of the worst parts of the country. So, not so great, not so great. Things did start turning around, at least here in Las Vegas, with partly because of the intervention of the First Lady of Las Vegas, Helen Stewart, who was a part of our kind of town's pioneer history. So when William Andrews Clark came through and decided to site a new railroad depot and maintenance facilities here in Las Vegas, which is why the town is here, if you're not aware. Um, he asked Helen Stewart, who was at the time in charge of what used to be the Las Vegas Rancho, um, one of the larger ranches in the area, and on the site of the old Mormon fort. And Clark goes to Helen Stewart and says, "Okay, well, I want to I want to buy your land." And Helen Stewart says, "Okay, but what about the Paiute?" When she heard that Clark wasn't going to set aside any land for the Paiute, she would actually personally set aside those 10 acres. She personally deeded those 10 acres of her ranch property that she hadn't been using, that the Paiute had been using, as the downtown Paiute reservation. So if you've been down to the Paiute Smoke Shop or their gigantic cannabis dispensary down there, and that was land deeded by Helen Stewart in the early 20th century. She was also, by the way, part of the drive to admit Native American children to schools. Indeed, the historic 4th Street School downtown, which she helped found, was the first public school anywhere in the state of Nevada that admitted Native American children. In, I want to say 1914, so a few years before most of the rest of the state. So by the 1920s, you started seeing, Native Americans becoming eligible for public services, including public school. In the 1940s, with the increasing activity of groups like LULAC and the NAACP, discriminatory laws were starting to become unenforceable, and they were starting to be repealed off the books. Finally, in 1965, we saw the creation of the Nevada Indian Claims Commission, which was a body set up to negotiate the return of certain lands back to Native Americans. And it's because of that we have the expansion in Native American reservation and trust land that we have seen since roughly the 1980s. Locally, I mentioned the Paiute Golf Course was part of that drive, so up in the northwest. And also, if you head out to Death Valley, the Shoshone recently got a new reservation in Death Valley. I mean, when I say recently, I mean like 2013, something like that. So this is very much an ongoing process of trying to restore some of the ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples of this area. Obviously, it's not one that goes uncontested. There are plenty of companies that would love to mine and drill and frack on that land, but it is one that is still ongoing. The next major group of migrants to Nevada, and I'm going kind of in chronological order of settlement, in case you're wondering why we're going to Asians next. So obviously Native Americans are here first. Asian Americans were kind of one of the first big waves of international migration into Nevada. You saw a large number of Chinese immigrants during the mining and railroad eras. And so 1848, gold is discovered at Sutter's Fort in California, and that news reverberates around the world. And people from all over the world go to seek their fortunes in the gold fields of California and later Nevada. And that applied just as much to folks in China. There was a number of Chinese immigrants who came over to try and strike it rich in the gold fields. Indeed, the Chinese, there are a couple of Chinese names for San Francisco, but one of the older and more poetic ones is Zhoujinshan, which means Old Gold Mountain in Mandarin. And that's the name for San Francisco, because San Francisco was where you'd go to set out into the gold fields. And so, I mean, that's still kind of linguistically remembered. So you saw a large number of Chinese immigrants coming in from about the 1850s. Relatively quickly, the unions got together and barred the Chinese from mining employment, and there was widespread discrimination in terms of employment and union membership and things like that. So folks went from being miners and prospectors and working the mines and things like that to being, to running restaurants and laundries and things like that around these mining camps, and also working on the railroads. A whole lot of your railroads in the early statehood era would have been built by Chinese labor. Northern Nevada be Chinese labor, Southern Nevada be Mexican labor. And oddly enough, Irish engineers. The Transcontinental Railway was built with Irish engineers. But so to describe some of the conditions of assault and legal neglect, I just want to mention the case of the Tonopah laundrymen. So there was an incident up in Tonopah, which is about halfway between here and Reno on the 95. It's also, incidentally, the other end of the Nevada test range. So the Tonopah test base, the Tonopah test range airport is like the second Area 51. But so anyway, Tonopah back in 1930, and this is as recently as the 1930s, was a bustling mining boomtown, and had, among other things, a Chinese laundry. There was some sort of a dispute between a few white gentlemen and the Chinese proprietor of this laundry, and so those white gentlemen dragged two elderly Chinese men who worked in the laundry, dragged them out of the laundry, beat them to death in the street in broad daylight in front of 20 some odd witnesses. But because all of those witnesses were Chinese, and remember, the Article 2 of the Constitution forbids any Chinese from giving testimony in court, that assault went entirely unpunished. So it was an era where if you were a racial minority, you could be dragged out into the street and killed in broad daylight in front of witnesses, and your assailants might not be punished. How? Jeez. Where have I heard that before? So obviously, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, right? Morning, Daniela. So, as in other communities, Asian Americans in Nevada have never made up a majority of any electoral district, and so most gains for the Asian American community came on the backs of gains for the African American community during the Civil Rights Movement. So in 1959, Nevada did pass its first Civil Rights Act outlawing employment discrimination, and a long wave of anti-discrimination measures in the 1960s and 70s. Incidentally, do you know that Nevada protects your right to not be discriminated against in the application of credit? Not necessarily something that is always true at the federal level. So, following those anti-discrimination measures, and the 1960s and 70s, and following greater migration into the United States from especially Southeast Asia, we saw an absolute explosion of the Asian American community in Nevada, which I am all for because I absolutely love Asian food. Filipinos are actually now the majority of Asians in Nevada, and the largest group of immigrants coming into the state in terms of country of origin, besides Mexican immigrants. So that's why if you ever wonder why your voting place has ballots in English, Spanish, and Tagalog, well, that would be why. But we do still have a variety of other Asian American ethnicities here in the valley. If you go drive down Spring Mountain, you will see plenty of them. And yeah, I think that's about what I got to say about Asian American civil rights in Nevada. We can talk about African American civil rights in Nevada. So Nevada was a staunchly Union state. You know, I don't know if you guys can see the cat right here. There is a cat. So Nevada is a staunchly Union state. They are anti-slavery, anti-secession. We were, in the battle between the blue and gray, we were on the side of the blue. Our state motto, Battle Born, refers to the fact that we were founded in the middle of the Civil War and as a result of the Civil War largely. Because, remember, Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, who were, remember at the time, the anti-racist party, Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, they all wanted to make sure that when the South came back into the country, they had a majority in the Senate. So that's part of why Nevada is a state. So, incidentally, Battle-born does not mean that there were any actual battles fought here during Nevada statehood. We did not have any significant battles of any kind during the Civil War that were fought here. Ow! She was content to just sit there, and I was fine to let her, and then she starts biting. So, anyway, because we were a staunchly Republican, staunchly pro-union, staunchly anti-slavery state, we didn't actually really see a whole lot of discrimination against African Americans in early Nevada. Now, that's not to say that people weren't racist, because it was the 1860s. Of course people were racist. But part of the thing was that, there just weren't all that many African Americans in Nevada. I think the 1910 census found 100 black people in the entire state or something like that. And I don't know if you've driven across Nevada lately. It is a big state. So as a consequence of that, you saw among the white inhabitants of Nevada something that was relatively common in Western states. Well, they're going to love you. Relatively common in Western states, which is kind of a paternalistic attitude towards black people. Oh, those poor dears. Well, we're not going to treat you like they did down in the Bible Belt. We're going to take care of you, right? Which is not exactly a good thing, but better than the alternative. That started to fade away, though, with the rise of the Great Depression and World War II and shifting settlement patterns, especially in southern Nevada. You've heard the story before. They're taking our jobs, right? And during recessions, during times of economic strife, anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-outgroup sentiment, any sort of racism, sexism, all that good sort of bigotry, can be amplified because of a sense of economic competition. So that started really popping up around the time of the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. The Hoover Dam project here, along with wartime projects like Nellis Air Force Base, the Henderson Magnesium Plant, further afield the Hawthorne Army Depot, etc., etc. Wartime facilities brought African Americans from all over the country, though, especially from the South, who were still suffering under the yoke of legally mandated Jim Crow segregation. They were looking for somewhere where it wasn't so bad. So there were black laborers showing up in Nevada looking for a job, looking for stuff to do. And there were soldiers, coming through here, building bases, training to go fight World War II. And with the growing black population came a growing anti-black sentiment, right? Came growing racism. So Nevada has never legally mandated segregation. We were never a Jim Crow state. We never actually, put down in the law that, hey, a black person and a white person are not allowed to ride on the same bus, right? We never put that down. But commercial interests drove segregation. Most casino owners, most resort owners felt that their white clientele would be so disgusted by the fact that they would have to share hotel amenities with a black person that they would not come, that they would choose to shop at another resort. So accordingly, commercial interest drove segregation. The Las Vegas Strip was segregated. Downtown Fremont was segregated. Most casinos did not serve African Americans. As I said before, the sign, no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans, was the sign of the times. That lasted up until the early days of the middle days of the Civil Rights Movement. 1960 comes around. 1960 comes around, and y'all, the South is burning, right? This is in the middle of the Montgomery bus boycott. This is a couple years before the Freedom Rides, but the sit-ins are happening, the marches are happening. The American South is on fire with riotous protest. So Dr. James McMillan, the president of the Las Vegas chapter of the NAACP, he went to a meeting with all of the major casino owners. And he basically said, okay, here's how we're going to do this. Either you desegregate your casinos, or we're going to make Las Vegas look like Montgomery and Selma. We're going to march civil rights protesters up and down the Strip. We're going to do sit-ins at your slot machines. We're going to do swim-ins in your pools. We're going to raise hell. And how do you think that is going to be for business, Mr. Businessman? So in 1960, almost without firing a shot, Las Vegas desegregates. Excuse me. But just because the city desegregated in terms of customers doesn't mean that employees and renters' rights were necessarily being respected. So in 1965, we did see the first comprehensive Nevada civil rights legislation, which did forbid discrimination by race in terms of housing, employment, public accommodations. But up until 1971, that employment part wasn't really enforced on most of the major on most employees in Nevada's single biggest industry, which is of course tourism. Up until 1971, the big casinos kind of just kept on discriminating, and they got sued for it. And so in 1971, they signed a consent decree that basically said, we're not admitting that we ever did anything racist in the past, but we're not going to do anything racist ever again. Promise. And so since then, casino employment has been more open along racial lines, although we still see discrimination on that front as well. For one thing, we didn't see a black-owned casino in Nevada until 2001. That was, by the way, what is now called the D downtown. At the time was called Fitzgerald's. And, by the way, it's not black-owned anymore. As recently as 1998, we didn't have a single African-American in the executive suites of any of Nevada's major gaming companies. So, and we also see other indications of the community's limited economic power, like low levels of entrepreneurship, low levels starting their own businesses. Also, lower levels of educational attainment, and significant disparities in terms of contact with the criminal justice system. And I want to point out, if you've been in the class with me for 16 weeks and you then obviously you know the way to read this. But if somebody were just kind of coming upon this slide cold, they might look and say like, oh, like, you know, well, black people can't get an education and they're a bunch of criminals. And it's like, that's not what I'm saying here at all. This is the effect of systemic racism, right? This is what happens when you have a society that's built on the backs of 400 years of slavery. So, again, the research says that criminality is roughly evenly distributed across the races. Although people just in different races commit different kinds of crime, but the rate is similar. Despite that, African Americans in Nevada are arrested at a rate 6 times higher than whites and even 3 times higher than Latinos. And that causes setbacks, right? Going to jail is a major thorn in one's economic side. So, as ever, we have come so far, yet we have so far to go. Latinos in Nevada. So obviously the name Nevada is actually a Spanish word, right? Incidentally, if you're wondering about that, they originally wanted to name the state Sierra Nevada, which is snowy range of mountains. Because nieve is snow, so Nevada means snow-covered, right? So first off, they wanted to originally name it after the mountains, the Sierra Nevada, but they decided that the second word was unnecessarily confusing. And second of all, if you remember that most of the people in Nevada lived in northern Nevada, in Washoe and Carson, Lander, and Story counties up there around like Lake Tahoe area, then you realize that, yeah, it kind of makes sense that you want to call your state Sierra Nevada. You all live in the Sierras. But now we are left with this amusing thing where one of the most arid states in the country, a large swath of which is desert, is named Snowy in Spanish. But anyway, so Nevada is a Spanish word. Obviously, Spanish speakers were the first Europeans to lay claim to this land and the first Europeans to set foot in this land. It was a Spaniard, Francisco Garces, that did. Latinos are the largest and fastest growing minority group in Nevada. And many of them were here. Actually, maybe I should have Latinos like next to Native Americans before Asians, because many of them were here before there was a Nevada, right? So we saw 2 major waves of migration of Latinos into the state. Obviously, we've seen kind of just levels of migration as well, but major waves happened again during the railroad era, which I think I mentioned. Las Vegas is a railroad town. That is why this place exists. We were the midway point between LA and Salt Lake, and so they were building railroad maintenance shops here to fix trains. That's why there's a Las Vegas. And lots of that railroad, the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake, lots of that railroad was built with Mexican labor, right? And at the same time, in response to these waves of migration, you also saw a commensurate response of segregation and exclusion from society. Extensive private segregation characterized much of the Latino experience in early Nevada. That was somewhat complicated in the middle of the 20th century because of a division between different sectors of the Latino community, particularly between the Cubans and the Mexicans, and how in their experience in, again, Nevada's largest industry, gaming. So what happened was that, Havana, Cuba was like Florida's Las Vegas, right? It was a spot that you would just kind of like, pop over to for the weekend and blow off some steam, have some drinks, lose some money on the slot machines, look at some dancing girls, and fly home, right? Because I don't know if you know, but between Key West, Florida, and Cuba is about 90 miles. It's not far at all. I mean, I don't think a bridge is feasible, but it would totally be within driving distance if there weren't an ocean in the way. So that all changed with the rise of the Castro regime and Cuban communism, because obviously all of a sudden all those casinos and hotels and resorts became bourgeois extravagances and counter-revolutionary. And also at the same time, the U.S. is imposing sanctions and saying, well, you can't visit there. Cuba is still to this day the only place in the world that the United States government, the only country in the world, the United States government says that its citizens are not allowed to visit. Now, other countries might say you're not allowed to come in, but Cuba says, come on in, Americans. America says you can't. That's the only country in the world where that's true. But anyway, you had all these Cuban gaming professionals, right? Blackjack dealers, craps dealers, slot machine repairmen, right? Who were all of a sudden out of work and trying to stay one step ahead of the Cuban Revolution. So a lot of them got on boats and planes and came to the United States, and they kind of washed up on the beaches of Florida going, okay, well, what do I do? And if you're a blackjack dealer, if you've been a blackjack dealer all your life, and you want to keep being a blackjack dealer, and it's America in the 1960s, well, you've got basically two choices. Las Vegas, Nevada, or Atlantic City, New Jersey. That's about it. So you get out here to Las Vegas, and the casinos are hiring some of these folks who are experienced casino professionals from Cuba. And the local Mexicans are like, hey, wait a second. You guys won't hire us as bartenders and blackjack dealers and all this, but you'll hire them? So that produced a disparity in the way different segments of the Latino community were treated, and left some political divisions that are just starting to heal now, but were a major part of political life in Nevada in the middle of the 20th century. So Latinos have had historically limited political power in Nevada, but their economic power is growing significantly, particularly in the form of small businesses. Something like half of Nevada's small businesses are owned by Latinos, even though they're not half of the population. So the question is, does that economic power become political power? And there are some encouraging early signs that say yes. The 2016 elections, I mean, I think I've said this before in class, but I knew Nevada was going to go for Hillary Clinton the night before the election, when they were showing aerial shots from the last day of early voting in Las Vegas. They were showing shots from a Cardenas market, the Mexican market. And, the lines going out and around the parking lot. I'm like, okay, Nevada's going blue because Latinos are showing up. Latinos are showing up and becoming a major, major part of the electorate, which we also saw in 2018. So hopefully, that becomes part of a future trend, and in 2020 and going forward, we see a more representative electorate here in the state of Nevada. Moving on to women's rights. Again, this is a crappy way of doing this, but kind of got to do it because they got to get through this stuff. Women's rights. So Nevada did grant women full suffrage before the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1914, which is, remember, 5 years before the 19th Amendment. But that's relatively late for a Western state. It is, for example, 7 years after California and nearly 30 after Wyoming. They were the first. And again, they still call themselves the equality state over it. What have you done for me lately, Wyoming? So, employment discrimination against women was extraordinarily widespread in Nevada, as it was pretty much everywhere in the country through even the late 20th century. Um, we remember the conversation about the 1964 Civil Rights Act and how the prohibition against discrimination in hiring on the account of sex was seen by many as a mischievous joke and not even enforced for the first, dozen years it was in effect. And that's not that long ago. I mean, that's my mother's generation, right? Not that long ago that we had significant discrimination in employment between men and women. And that does include in Nevada's largest industry, gaming. So at the casinos, women were allowed to be, cocktail servers and keno callers and things like this, but weren't allowed to be bartenders, card dealers, etc. And I'm not a big gambler, but apparently you tip your dealer. So typically the positions that women were barred from were the positions where you could earn major tip money. And so it took until 1981 in a class action lawsuit against the casinos that the casinos agreed that they would start considering women for more lucrative positions. In 1981, I mean, that's only 5 years before I was born. That's not that long ago. As a child of the 90s, I still think of 1981 as 20 years ago, but it's actually closer to 40 years ago. Anyway, discrimination in hiring is not unique to Nevada's private sector either. We look even today at Nevada's public sector, and okay, admittedly these numbers are about 5-6 years out of date, but even today in the public sector, women make up a large number of the lower paid parts of Nevada's public sector, and a much smaller number of managerial positions. We are still living in a world where managerial positions are skewed something like 65-35 male, whereas secretarial positions are almost the opposite towards female, right? So we still see employment discrimination and employment disparities. We still see evidence of employment discrimination, I should say, in the Nevada economy today, but it has gotten better. We still see a significant economic disparity between men and women in Nevada. Women in Nevada make 82 cents on the dollar for every dollar that a man makes. That's average men and women. If you break it down by race, it gets a lot more depressing. But it should be noted that 82 cents on the dollar is actually better than the national average, which is 73. So we do see a significant economic disparity between men and women in Nevada, but we are a more equal state than most on that particular measure. And if you've grown up in Nevada and you are tired of seeing your state way down in the 48 kind of area on so many rankings, here's a good one. We are among the top 10 states in terms of economic disparity between men and women. In terms of smaller economic disparity. So we're on the good side of that list. We're also a state with a huge number of women in politics, which is freaking awesome. I mean, so we have 2 women senators, and we have 2 women who are currently in the House of Representatives from Nevada. So a full 2/3 of our 6-member federal delegation is women. The 2017 legislature was the most female in the nation, 40%. Obviously, I haven't updated this slide because the 2019 legislature was the first in the history of the nation to be majority women. Nevada's 2019 legislature was a majority women. And that has a consequence to our politics. Nevada was the first state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in over 30 years. And, that could really seriously change the lives of a lot of people around the country. So there's hope, right? We can talk about the gays and the transes, right? The LGBT community, um, the queer folk, my people. State of Nevada is one of the only 18 states where you cannot be fired, evicted, or denied public accommodations for being LGBT. There's only 18 of them across the country. Nevada is one of them. So Nevada's sodomy law was repealed in 1993. We saw Nevada adding sexual orientation as a hate crime category in 1995, meaning that if you attack somebody because they're gay, it's now extra time in jail. Right? We saw, interestingly enough, and this shows you how Western Republicans are different from their Southern counterparts, we saw a Republican governor, Brian Sandoval, signing into law non-discrimination protections for both sexual orientation and gender identity in 2009 and 2011, respectively. So that was when Nevada became a state where you can't be fired for being LGBT. So all of that is great and awesome. And part of why I live here and not Arizona, right? We also have a constitutional amendment barring marriage equality. So the voters did vote, and when the voters of Nevada were asked, do you think the gays should marry? The voters of Nevada said, nay, we do not think the gays should marry. So in 2002, they did in fact ban gay marriage, which was incidentally 2 years before gay marriages were performed anywhere in the country. They banned gay marriage. Little bit of a preemptive strike there. The state did start recognizing domestic partnerships in 2009, but did not fully recognize same-sex marriages until 2015, and the case of Obergefell v. Hodges struck down constitutional amendments banning marriage equality. It should be noted, though, that if the unthinkable happens and the Supreme Court does overturn its same-sex marriage decision, Nevada would revert to the 2002 amendment barring marriage equality, and Nevada's gays and lesbians would not be married anymore, according to the state of Nevada, unless we actually take that off the books, which is something that we should really think about doing. Part of the reason for the, leftward lurch in Nevada's stance towards the LGBT community is because we are a state that is heavily dependent on tourism. And LGBT people, particularly white cis gay men, are often in possession of a lot of free time and disposable income. I mean, not all of us. A lot of us are poor and depressed. But if you're one of these casinos, you would really love for people to have their gay wedding at the Rio, So it's kind of all upside for Nevada's biggest industry. So the casino industry has been generally supportive. They want to get that rainbow tourism showing up. And so because of that, we've seen Nevada kind of moving forward relatively quickly on LGBT protections in law. Should be noted that, like any non-discrimination laws, it is still very difficult to fight these cases, but at least the law is on your side in the state of Nevada. Any questions about civil rights in Nevada? Nope. All right. Moving on to civil liberties then, really quickly. So, the Nevada Constitution has a Declaration of Rights in it. And originally, that was an important section of the Constitution, because if you recall, when the Nevada State Constitution was written in 1864, there was no 14th Amendment. And that means that the prevailing rule at the time was the rule established in the case of Barron versus Baltimore. Remember John Barron and the wharf, he got all silted up because the city of Boston diverted city of Baltimore, diverted a stream. Remember that, dude? Remember the lesson of that case? The lesson of that case was the Bill of Rights only applies to the feds, not to the state governments. And so most states that were founded after Barron included some restatement of the Bill of Rights in their state constitutions. That way, the state government would be held to the same standards that the federal government would as well. In many of those states, like California, Oregon, and Washington, are West Coast neighbors and hopefully future Pacific and sister nations. Judges in those states actually interpreted their state constitutions to be more expansive than the federal constitution. So, for example, the California state constitution gives you the right to protest on publicly accessible areas of private property. This is established under the case of Pruneyard v. Robbins. Now, I explained all of this to the officer that was arresting me, and he didn't much care. But the Attorney General certainly did when they dropped the charges. So Nevada, though, we've chosen not to do that. Judges in Nevada have basically said that the Nevada Declaration of Rights was intended to mirror the Bill of Rights, not to expand upon it. And so the rights granted by the Nevada Constitution are equivalent to the U.S. Constitution, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, with two major differences. One, so normally, for a jury trial and to conclude in a case, you need that jury to vote unanimously to find for the plaintiff or for the defendant, right? And that's still the case in Nevada in criminal trials. If you're on trial for whatever, if you're on trial for murder, then they still need the whole jury to agree that you did it before they send you to jail. But in Nevada, in civil cases, in lawsuits, juries only need 3/4 agreement, 9 out of 12, rather than the 12 out of 12 unanimity required in criminal cases. The reason for that is because people back in early Nevada would get hurt in the mines, and they would try and sue their employers for getting injured on the job. And the mining companies would just go and find one of the jurors from the trial and bribe them to vote in favor of the mining company's interests. And as long as you could get, 11, if you could only get 11 out of 12, you couldn't finish the case. It would be declared a mistrial, and probably that person doesn't have the resources to try again. So, in the early years of statehood, they set it up so that, if the mining companies wanted to bribe a jury to declare a mistrial, they'd have to bribe 4 jurors instead of 1. And so they figured four jurors is much more expensive than 1 juror, so they're probably not going to do it. And that is why juries only need a 3/4 vote in civil cases. It's because mining companies would straight up bribe juries. We also have, in Nevada, greater protections against eminent domain. Eminent domain, for those who are not aware, is the process by which the government can take your property for a public purpose, and it is they have to pay you for it. They can't just take your property, kick you off, and say go screw yourself. They do actually have to pay you for it, but they can force you to sell. They can put you into a forced sale. So if we're building a highway from or if you're building that new train from Las Vegas to Victorville, and your house is in the way, the government can be like, hey, your house is in the way of the train track. You have to sell to us at fair market value. Here is a check. Get out. So they can do that. Well, in 2005, there was a court case called Kelo versus the City of New London. There's a case out of Connecticut. And in the Kelo case, what had happened was the city had done that to a guy's property. They'd taken his property for, it wasn't a highway. I want to say it was like a park or a community center or something that they were going to build. And then something happened and they didn't have the money to build the thing anymore. And so the property just kind of sat there in the government's hands for years until the city's feeling a little cash strapped, sold it to developers to build a shopping center there. And so this dude whose property it was like, hey, wait a second, you're allowed to take stuff for a public purpose, but you're not allowed to just force me to sell stuff to you and then turn around and sell it to a private company. That's not the point of that. Well, it got up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court amazingly actually said the government is allowed to take your property and then turn around and sell it to a private developer. That they don't have to take your property for a government use, that as long as the government thinks that the private developer is going to make, is going to achieve some public purpose, they can do that. That is really messed up, right? That is really messed up. So the citizens of Nevada got together and wrote a ballot initiative so that in Nevada, that is not the case. In Nevada, first of all, the government is not allowed to take your land with the intention of selling it to a private developer. Second, if the land sits idle for 5 years, the government has to offer you the right to buy it back. And third, if the government does sell it to private hands, they have to offer it to you first, which is significantly reined in those eminent domain protections. So in Nevada, they can really only take your house if they're trying to build a road through there, not if they're trying to sell it to somebody else. Come on the backside of this. I promise we're almost done. We're almost done. We're almost done. Parties and elections. Okay, we broadly saw 5 party eras in Nevada politics locally. Nevada was a Republican state. It was founded to be a Republican state. So from the Republican Party's founding of the state up until 1892, for about, the 35 years, the Republican Party is dominant in the state of Nevada. And then the state gets caught up in the craze of the Silver Party. Does anyone remember from their U.S. history the Silver Party? Wikipedia bimetallism. It's a thing. So basically, long story short, back in the day, the way that we printed money was our money was backed by some sort of precious metal. So if you had a dollar bill, that was actually essentially a coupon that you could exchange for, 1 ounce of gold or something like that, right? And that's, if you've heard of Fort Knox, Maryland, that was the gold repository where we stored all the gold to back American currency. Well, there were a lot of folks who were hoping that because gold was still kind of a scarce material, even in the turn of the 20th century, that we could back our currency with silver as well. This would be an inflationary thing, so it would make hopefully prices and wages rise. It would make money a lot freer to circulate. It was an attempt to try and deal with some of the economic panics that were happening at the time, because a constrained money supply really didn't help some of these economic crashes. Nevada being a major silver mining state, we went all in on the Silver Party for about 10 years there, or for about 15 years there. And after the Silver Party thing kind of died, Nevada was kind of a free-for-all. Throughout the early 20th century, the Republicans mostly got the statewide offices, the Democrats mostly controlled the legislature, um, which was also, by the way, the pattern throughout the early 21st century, too. Um, then FDR came in, and FDR did so many things for this state, um, starting with the Hoover Dam and moving on from there, that the state was broadly Democratic up until the 1980s Reagan Revolution. Since then, we've seen an era of relatively personalistic politics. Nevadans, as I said before, are more likely to vote a split ticket, meaning vote for some politicians of one party, some politicians of another party. We have relatively moderate state relatively moderate state parties. We have Democrats that are significantly more conservative than the national average. I got to tell you, when I heard a Democrat start talking about how they needed to protect the Second Amendment, I was like, oh man, I am not in California anymore. Democrats are more conservative than the national average. Republicans slightly more liberal, especially on social issues. You remember a Republican governor in the 2000s signed non-discrimination protections for LGBT folk. That wouldn't happen in like a Georgia or an Iowa, right? But it does happen here in Nevada because we have a relatively moderate system of state parties. Incidentally, the most conservative Republican state party in the entire country. I asked this in class and I let my students guess, and usually they throw out things like, oh, Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Kentucky. It's actually California. They don't have any power, but if you look at their platforms and their ideas, and they're actually the most conservative Republicans in the country. They're just heavily outvoted. So if you want to become part of that whole democratic process, you do have to be 18 years old to vote. It was originally 21, and then the 26th Amendment happened, and then 18-year-olds could vote. You do have to be a resident at least 30 days. The Constitution still says you have to be a resident 6 months, but the Supreme Court actually struck that down as unconstitutional. So they said 30 days is the longest you can have it, so in Nevada it's 30 days. You do have to register. Again, I haven't updated this slide. It is just registertovoteenv.gov. Why is my keyboard not working? Not right now, Mom. And hold on just a second. I need to text my mom. Okay. You also cannot be a felon or declared mentally incompetent, but I should mention that we are one of the more liberal states on felon reenfranchisement. Some states have exceedingly difficult processes to get your voting rights back after you've committed a felony. Florida, for example, was famously very, very difficult. You had to actually go ask the governor personally. They restore like a couple hundred people's voting rights a year, and often they would deny these petitions. Florida's got a whole battle going on over that. If you Google Florida Amendment 2, that would be that is a whole campaign that's going on right now. In Nevada, most first-time felons automatically get their voting rights back after they have served their time. So once you're off parole, probation, out of prison, all of that good stuff, you get your voting rights back. There are some exceptions. If you are in this situation, I do recommend that you call an attorney, call legal aid, call somebody that can get you a more specific answer. But in Nevada, most felons do gain their rights back after they've served their sentence. So that is an important thing, by the way. A lot of people think that, hey, once you commit a felony, you're done for life. That's actually not true. In Nevada, most felons get their right to vote back. So let's see. We have direct democracy. We have the initiative, referendum, and recall. There's currently a recall petition circulating for Mayor Goodman, which I am strongly in support of, by the way. So we have a couple of different types of direct democracy. One of those is the initiative. The initiative is a process by which voters can directly propose laws. Voters can write the law, sign off on it, and write their own laws without the involvement of the legislature whatsoever. So you do need 10% of registered voters in the state to sign off on that. So right now in Nevada, let's see, how many voters are there? As of this very moment in Nevada, come on, 2020 statistics, why? Damn you, Barbara Sagavsky. Why do you bury this stuff? As of last month, come on, there were 1,622,000 registered voters in Nevada. So you need about 162,000 signatures in order to pass a voter initiative. There's a different process depending on what voters approve. If it is a statute, meaning a regular law, that statute goes to the legislature first, and they have 90 days to pass something similar, or the initiative becomes law unaided, but the legislature can tweak it a little bit. On the other hand, constitutional amendments, they don't go to the legislature at all, but they do have to pass 2 elections. So you may remember the electricity deregulation one, question 3, from last time around. That was a repeat. That was its second election. So if it fails either election, it gets voted down. So it's kind of a difficult process. So the state of Nevada has been trying very, very hard, historically speaking, to make it so that you had to actually go out to rural Nevada and collect signatures. So that you couldn't just be in Vegas and Reno collecting your 130,000 signatures. Because let's be honest, 130,000 signatures during normal times when there are people out and about here in Las Vegas, 130,000 signatures in a town of 2.5 million people is not that difficult. It's just time consuming, but it's doable. You could very easily do all of your signature gathering right here in Las Vegas. So for a while, signature gatherers also had to get 10% of the registered voters in 13 of Nevada's 17 counties. That got struck down by the Supreme Court because the value of a signature can't change based on where you are, because that would essentially say that, oh well, in Clark County you got to get 125,000 signatures, and in Esmeralda County you've only got to get 37 signatures, right? So they went. The state went back and tried to make it, okay, well, we'll make it proportional. You have to get the percentage of signatures from a county based on the percentage of voters that county contributed in the last statewide election. And that got struck down too, because it was still made it more valuable to get a signature from somebody from a less populous county. And the principle is one person, one vote, right? So finally, the state moved to what we have now, which is a congressional district requirement. You have to get 10% of the signatures in all 4 of Nevada's congressional districts. Well, 3 of the 4 of those congressional districts have 85% or more of their voters in Clark County, and the 4th has 85% of its voters in Washoe County. So it's not that hard at all to simply go to Vegas and Reno for your signature gathering. You still do not have to go out to Ely or Winnemucca or anything like that, despite attempts by the state to try and make that possible. We also have a referendum, which is a similar process to an initiative, just the legislature is referring issues rather than voters. Voters can demand a referendum on an existing law with 10% of the signatures. And if there is a referendum, crucially, that law cannot be repealed by the legislature. It requires another referendum before, another public vote before it gets repealed. So Nevada's abortion laws are a great example of this. See, pro-choice activists in Nevada led a referendum to repeal Nevada's abortion laws, knowing that they would fail. This weird bit of political judo. So pro-choice activists put abortion on the ballot, knowing that abortion would be upheld. But see, since it was upheld at the ballot box, the legislature can't repeal it without another vote. So there's that extra layer of protection for, in this particular case, abortion rights in Nevada. Finally, we have the recall, which is a process by which voters can fire an office holder. It is rarely successful. It is a long shot, and you do need 25% of the voters who voted in the last election. Now, there was an attempt by the Nevada state legislature to make it so that 25% of the voters just meant you needed a number equivalent to 25% of the voters. But the Nevada Supreme Court has decided that no, only voters who actually voted in the office holder's last election can participate. So that makes it a lot harder. So for this recall against Carolyn Goodman, you need 25% of the voters who voted in the April 2019 municipal primary, and there's only about 25,000 of those around Las Vegas. So it's rarely successful. It's never been successful statewide. Last time it was successful was in 2009 on the Fernley City Council, although I am hoping I can change that slide soon. Second recalls in Nevada are very discouraged, because if you want to try and recall somebody again after they've already been up for recall once, first off, you can't do it for 6 months. They get 6 months to be on the job without being harassed. And then second, you got to pay the cost of the first election. So often, second recalls basically don't happen in Nevada. See, we do have term limits in the state of Nevada. Why is my keyboard not working? We have term limits in the state of Nevada. Term limits in Nevada are 12 years for every office except judges. It was originally supposed to be 12 years for everybody, but the Nevada Supreme Court actually stepped in and stripped out and carved out an exception for judges, based on some flimsy thing about the Constitution, but really it's because they didn't want to deal with term limits. So they were passed in 1996, meaning that the first time anybody was termed out, because they started their clocks in 1996, was in the 2008 elections. So it's a relatively recent thing that we have term limits. It is 12 years in any one office. You can run again for a different office, but you can never go back to the same one. And it's still kind of too early to see really what impact Nevada's term limits have had on our state, but the evidence is overwhelming from other states that have done term limits that the impact is typically to increase the power of lobbyists and large corporations at the legislature. And so when we have a legislature that is so low resource, that is so part-time, only 4 months out of every 2 years, term limits mean that legislators do not develop expertise and lobbyists do. I'm going to talk about this really quickly. We do have primaries for every office except the president since 1910. And that was actually, if you got your ballot at home, that's what this is. This is the primary election, meaning we decide who's going to be on the ballot for the general in November. Parties have been allowed to choose how they allocate presidential delegates, and since they've been, we were historically a caucus state, but since 1996, the Republicans went with a primary. Then from 2000 to 2012, both used primaries. Then in 2016, both switched back to caucuses. In 2020, The Republicans didn't even have one, but the Democrats had a caucus. So it kind of flips back and forth. But for every office other than the president, so for federal Congress, for Senate, for governor, for all those, for the state legislature, all that good stuff, we have primary elections. You may also notice on your ballot, let's see, it's not always there. Here we go. You may notice it says on some of these at the bottom, where is it? None of these candidates. That is it says none of these candidates. Nevada is the only state in the entire union where you are allowed to vote for nobody. So it is nationally unique. So so people ask me, what happens if none of the above wins? Do I get to vote? Does nobody get elected? Do we just leave that office unfilled? That's not what happens. That whoever is in second place wins, or is elected. But can you imagine how much legitimacy they have? Like, hi, I'm Allie Martin. I'm a city councilwoman for the city of Las Vegas. I came in second behind nobody. Right? Obviously, that person wouldn't have a huge Democratic mandate. It was challenged in 2012 by the Republicans and upheld by the Supreme Court. Really quickly, lobbying in Nevada. We do have heavy lobbyist activity here in Nevada, and that's partially because our legislators are so low resource that they are in some ways dependent on lobbyists for information and connections. Obviously, the most influential industry is, hey, guess what? Gaming. Gaming makes huge campaign contributions. Gaming makes more contributions to the Nevada State Legislature in a typical cycle than any single industry does to the California State Legislature. And remember, California is 10 times the size of Nevada. So that is a massive amount of money, huge amounts of connections. So we all kind of know if the casinos want something, they get it. Other interests, we've got a teachers union that has had some power. We saw this recently because they threatened to strike at the beginning of the year, and they actually won some concessions from the district. This is one a lot of people don't know about. A lot of people think Nevada's mining days. A lot of people think Nevada's mining days are behind us, but there's a whole lot of mining going on out there in the desert. They're just really quiet about it, and new techniques are not very labor intensive, so it's not like you're hearing about 10,000 miners in a town out in the desert. No, we're talking about like 3 guys in a trailer kind of operations. But there's a lot of mining that goes on in Nevada, especially up in northern Nevada along the Humboldt River, along that I-80 corridor. Some of the richest gold mines in the world are up there. And they still have that sweetheart tax deal where they're only taxed on their profits. Yeah, that's still a thing. We have the lowest mining tax in the nation, even though we're the biggest gold mining state in the nation. Obviously, like anywhere, organized labor is a major force of democratic politics, which is honestly actually surprising because we are a right-to-work state, and a lot of people don't have a misunderstanding of what it means to be a right-to-work state. A lot of people think that it means that you can be fired for whatever, whenever. And you can be fired for whatever, whenever. That's not what being in a right-to-work state means. What it means to be in a right-to-work state is it means that you cannot be required to contribute to a union as a condition of your employment. So, in California, if you get a job at a union workplace, you're going to have to pay some part of your paycheck to the union, either as union dues or what they call fair share fees, which are slightly lower, but you don't get to vote in the union. In Nevada, if you join a union workplace, like, for example, Clark County Schools, then, as a teacher, you get to choose, do I want to join the union or not? And obviously not joining the union means that you get to keep all of your money, and so a lot more people choose not to join the union. But we have amazingly strong unions here in Las Vegas, particularly the culinary union, Local 226, that are engines of local democratic politics. And past Senator Harry Reid was particularly well connected with that network of organized labor. Obviously, other businesses have, the Chamber of Commerce business typically lobbies on the Republican side, as it does everywhere else. Okay. Oh my God. Okay, so that was a long lecture. Really quick, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and pop them up in the chat. I am going to do some course announcements really quick for the folks who didn't get them at the very beginning of class, because I think I was talking to myself when I made them the first time, to be honest. This is the last lecture. This is it. You have made it. You are at the end of the course. You have completed Political Science 101. The exam is going to be available literally once I get done with this lecture here. I'm going to be calling my mother and dealing with Evan, but yeah, I'll talk about the essay grades. So this is the last lecture. Exam will be up once this lecture is over through the end of Sunday night. So you need to take it before midnight on Sunday. If it goes into 12:01 Monday, that is a problem. It's not unlocked yet. I'm gonna be unlocking it right after this lecture. Second, grades for exam 2. I haven't really looked at them yet, but I'm going to. There will probably be a bump for exam 2 because the average was a little low. So there will probably be a bump there. Also, for the 3 or 4 of you that were part of my last attempt to do a review quiz, you will be getting your extra credit. Essay grades, I expect them Monday or Tuesday, probably. Grades for the whole class are due Wednesday, so I have to have them done by then. And attendance, as long as you've been logging in to Canvas regularly, you have nothing to worry about there. I will take care of it. If you see anything on your gradebook that is incorrect, if you're still missing a grade from something that's not the essay or the third exam, please get in touch with me so that we can make sure that we solve that before grades are due on Wednesday. But you will know where you stand in this class by Wednesday at the very latest, I promise. Because otherwise they get very mad at me. Okay, so let's move on to the review quiz. Thesis and rough draft grades. There are no grades. They are check plus check. They're credit, no credit. And if you turned in your paper, normally I do those at the very, very end because I have you turn in your thesis and rough draft with your paper, but probably I'm just going to give everybody credit. Here we go. Okay, so if you haven't done this before, this is Kahoot. It is an online quiz platform. It works best if you have 2 devices. So if you have one device to watch the question on and another device to answer with. So you just go to kahoot.it, or if you have the app on your phone, and enter in that game pin, you can join us in our review quiz. I'm going to give everybody about, please go ahead and put your name as it appears on the roster so that I know who to give extra credit to, because I will be giving extra credit. If I get all 8 of you participating, I'll probably give extra credit to the top 3. only get like 3 or 4 participating, then I'll probably give extra credit to like the top 1. But we'll see how many show up and participate. So if you'd like extra credit on the final, stick around. It will be 4 points worth of extra credit. That's worth missing 2 questions. Go find your cell phones and come play with us. I'm going to go get some more water and give everybody like a couple minutes to join up. And we'll be right back. I'm very hard to hear. How about this? That better? Awesome. Yeah, you don't actually have to download anything for this, Kathy. Oh, we got 3. You can't just use the website. Just go to kahoot.it and put in the pin. Yeah, you answer on the other device. So you're gonna watch on here and answer on your phone or something like that. Okay. So, let's get this started, shall we? Alright, Unit 3 review quiz. 2, 1. Okay, first question. Until 2014, Nevada was one of 10 states without... Is that an individual income tax, an appellate court, a separate controller and treasurer, or significant agricultural exports? Again, until 2014, Nevada was one of 10 states without, is that an individual income tax, an appellate court, a separate controller and treasurer, or significant agricultural exports? Does it want me to answer? Oh, there it goes. So, looks like most of you got that correct. Yes, until 2014, Nevada was one of 10 states without an appellate court. In 2014, they created the Court of Appeals, but again, you kind of have to bounce your case off the Supreme Court to get it there. So, an individual income tax, we don't have one of those, but we didn't add one in 2014. So, until 2014, it doesn't work. We also have a separate controller and treasurer, but again, that didn't change in 2014. And I think there's more than 10 states that don't have significant agricultural exports. Look at all those little ones up in New England and stuff. So you get points for not only if you answer correctly, but also how quickly you answer. So that is a bit of a riddle. Second, the act of Congress requiring the federal government to hire well-qualified public servants in 1883 was that the Pendleton Civil Service Act, the McCain-Feingold Act, the Hatch Act, or the Higher Qualified Workers Act of 1883? Can I make my head... Oh, yeah. Definitely. Let me move me out of the way. There we go. Yep, there we go. Now I'm out of the way. I'm just going to turn off my head entirely here. Sorry, I'm trying not to be in your way. But in a second here, I'm going to turn off my head. Okay. That was, in fact, the Pendleton Civil Service Act. A lot of people are going for the obvious guess, but that was kind of obviously a guess. Okay, I'm gonna... There. Now... Yep. That should give me... There, my head's entirely gone. Out of the way. Here's the current scoreboard. Isabella in the game. All right. Third question. At the turn of the 20th century, so 1900, which political party was dominant in Nevada politics? Was that the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Free Soil Party, or the Silver Party? Again, at the turn of the 20th century, so that's 1900, which political party was dominant in Nevada politics? Was that the Silver Party, the Free Soil Party, the Democratic Party, or the Republican Party? Just went over this today. All right. One person remembered that Nevada was crazy for the Silver Party. Nevada was nuts for the Silver Party. So Daniela, congrats. Yes, Nevada was big into the bimetallism. So for about that 15 years around the turn of the 20th century, Nevada was heavily into the Silver Party. After that, it was a bit of a free-for-all until FDR, then it was Democratic till FDR, and then we have our current system. After an agency in the federal government has devised a rule, it sends the rule to the blank for approval. Would that be the Office of Management and Budget, the Federal Register, the Office of Rule Enforcement, or the General Accounting Office? Again, after an agency has devised a rule, it sends the rule to the blank for approval. Would that be the Office of Management and Budget, the Federal Register, the Office of Rule Enforcement, or the General Accounting Office? And people are not remembering that chapter 15 on the bureaucracy, huh? It was, in fact, the Office of Management and Budget. That is the White House's tool for controlling the bureaucracy. Remember, the OMB has the final approval on Not only agency is the originator of agency budgets, so Congress has to sign off on that, but it also has got the final approval on any rule change. So making sure that any real rules and regulations issued by the bureaucracy are consistent with the president's ideology. Right? Oh, hey, Dark Horse coming from the back. All right. Judicial cases today may be important tomorrow because of the concept of blank. Is that judicial review, legal formation, civil law, or precedent? Again, judicial cases today may be important tomorrow because of the concept of blank. Is that judicial review, legal formation, civil law, or precedent? Got any pre-law students in here? You should get this one right. Shoot, where did my water go? I got more water and I left it over there. Actually working. I'm sorry, I'm really thrilled. This is the first time I've actually gotten Kahoot to work on video like this. It's good, it's good. Yes, it is in fact the concept of precedent. Precedent is the idea that similar cases should be decided in similar ways. So cases decided in the past that are similar to cases that we're facing today are relevant and binding on future judges. I'm gonna go get that water bottle wherever it went. And leaderboard. Ooh. Oh, this game is getting spicy. All right. Next question. A filibuster is a power unique to the blank. Is that Congress, the House, the Senate, or the presidency? Again, a filibuster is a power unique to the blank. Is that Congress, the House, the Senate, or the presidency? If you're smart, you can eliminate one of the answers just based on the clip art. Where do they get to filibuster? All right, looks like everybody successfully remembered that the filibuster is a power of the Senate, not the House, and not Congress, because remember, Congress is both parts. The House and the Senate together make up Congress. So the Senate is the only one with the filibuster. In the House, we have a rules committee that determines time limits for debates. In the Senate, they get unlimited time. That's how they can filibuster. All right, Audrey on fire. Isabella coming up. Someone adversely affected or suffering imminent harm would be able to satisfy the legal concept of, is that standing, due process, justiciability, or amicus curiae? Again, someone adversely affected or suffering imminent harm would be able to satisfy the concept of, is that standing, due process, justiciability, or amicus curiae? So, standing is the answer we were looking for there. Remember that there are certain criteria for a case to be heard by the courts, and one of them is that the parties involved have standing, meaning that they are the actual parties who were harmed in a case, right? So you can't do hypotheticals, meaning you can't do, hey, I think this policy is going to harm somebody in the future. And you can't sue on somebody else's behalf. You have to be a person who was harmed to sue, and that is the concept of standing. It is part of the idea of due process, but due process refers to many more things. Yeah, more points when you're quicker. But due process refers to many more things than just standing. It's a whole gaggle of stuff. All right, question 8. The cabinet secretary who sits farthest away from the president at cabinet meetings is the secretary of... Is that Homeland Security, Defense, State, or Treasury? Again, the cabinet secretary that sits furthest from the president at cabinet meetings is the secretary of... Is that Homeland Security, Defense, State, or Treasury? This happens to be the Bush cabinet, and I'm kind of counting on most of you not remembering who any of those folks were in the Bush cabinet. There's Dick Cheney, Bush's brain. A lot of people remembered then. Homeland Security is, in fact, the furthest away from the president. Why? Because cabinet secretaries in whole cabinet meetings are seated in the order of the creation of their department, and Homeland Security is the newest department. So congrats to the three of you who got that one. I honestly thought that one would be trickier. All right. Number 9, a successful president uses the power of the office to argue, enforce, debate, or persuade. Again, a successful president uses the power of the office to argue, enforce, debate, or persuade. Okay. A lot of people have, again, a bunch of people remember this one. Presidents are not kings. Presidents are not dictators, at least not at the moment, we hope. And so presidents do best when they can persuade the huge apparatus of the federal government and the nation to go along with their plans, which is partially why our present president is flailing so very badly. He makes no attempts to persuade. He just kind of does his thing. And hey, better you find out that you're doing not so great now and not on the exam, right? So the reason that congressional members should return frequently to their districts is the need to what? Is it to seek new challengers, take advantage of their franking privileges, win elections, or promote the president's agenda? Again, the reason that congressional members should return frequently to their districts is the need to, is that seek new challengers, take advantage of their franking privileges, win elections, or promote the president's agenda. Remember your Mayhew. Most of you know what drives members of Congress. Members of Congress, first and foremost, are there to get reelected, right? We're not saying that we know that that's their behavior, but we are saying that it explains their behavior very well. The idea that no other branch can check the president is known as the blank. Is that the unitary executive theory, the take care clause, the imperial theory, or the supremacy theory? I forgot my camera's off, sweet. Again, is that the idea that no other branch can check the president is known as, is that the unitary executive theory, the take care clause, the imperial theory, or the supremacy theory? The answers are rolling in. Seconds left. All right. That was a toughie, apparently. So the unitary executive theory is the idea that, the Constitution puts the charge of executing the laws in the hands of the president, and therefore no other entity of the government is allowed to supersede that. It is called the unitary executive theory, highly associated with both the W. Bush and now the Trump administrations. So we know who got that one. Question 12. The second in command in the House leadership is known as is that the minority whip, the majority leader, the majority whip, or the minority leader? And the second in command in the House, is that the majority whip, the majority leader, the minority whip, the majority leader, the majority whip, or the minority leader? You saw through my trickery. So in the House, leadership is headed by a Speaker of the House. The majority leader is second in command. In the Senate, the majority leader is first in command. So, well, technically behind the vice president, but he never shows up. But you saw through my clever trickery. Damn it. (13) Express powers of the president include all of the following except the power to make treaties, commander-in-chief, the power to declare war, or the power to grant pardons. Again, express powers of the president include all of the following except the power to make treaties, commander-in-chief, the power to declare war, the power to grant pardons. Which one of those does the president not have? You noticed Congress in the Constitution is given the power to declare war. That hasn't stopped many modern presidents from starting a bunch of wars, but in the Constitution, Congress is given the express power to declare war. Oop! All right, Jamal. Yeah, I'm going to give the top 3 extra credit because there's 6 of you, so. Next to last question. The Lochner era from 1905 to 1937 was an era in which the courts... Now, the president totally has the power of pardons. Did the courts in the Lochner era deny individual economic liberty, address civil rights, promote workers' rights, or deny workers' rights? Again, during the Lochner era, did the courts deny individual economic liberty, address civil rights, promote workers' rights, or deny workers' rights? Yeah, presidents totally have pardon power. That is in the Constitution. It is in there. It's one of the few express powers in there. So yeah, the sad part is that when he says he can pardon himself, he might actually be right. So, no guesses for Lochner? Only 2 people, 3. Okay, there we go. Only 3 people even tried to answer this question, but most of you got it right. So Lochner versus New York was a landmark Supreme Court case which struck down a law limiting the number of hours that bakers in New York could work. And so it set off an era during which the courts were very hostile to wage and hour restrictions, workplace safety laws, minimum wage laws, etc., overtime, etc., etc. And maybe next time I'll make it 90 seconds. I keep forgetting there's a 10-second delay between when I talk and when I do things on here and when you actually see it. So the Lochner era was about denying workers' rights in the name of individual economic liberty, indeed. Looks like the biggest battle here is for third. Going into the last question, Daniela and Audrey look like they have locked up 2 of the 3 extra credit spots, so the battle is between Isabella and Jamal. Good luck. Last question. Of the 3 major forms of direct democracy in the U.S., which is not permitted in Nevada? Is that the recall, the referendum, the initiatives? Are all 3 of them actually permitted in Nevada? Again, is that the recall, or of the 3 major forms of direct democracy, which is not permitted in Nevada? Is that the referendum, the recall, the initiative, or are all 3 actually permitted in Nevada? We just went over this. See if you remember. Again, you have seen through my trickery. All 3 forms of direct democracy are, in fact, permitted in Nevada. We have the referendum, we have the recall, and we have voter ballot initiatives. Which leaves us with, drum roll please, our leaderboard. In 3rd place, Isabella. In 2nd, Audrey. And on the top of our podium, Daniela. Congratulations, I am screenshotting this right now. And I will make sure that all of you get your 4 points extra credit on the exam, which again starts right after I sign off here and Sunday night at midnight. Thank you all for being part of a phenomenal class. Sorry that the circumstances got a little difficult towards the end there, but stay home, stay safe, cover your face, and I hope that I wish all of you the best of luck in everything that you do here at CSN and everything that you go on to do. Good luck on the exam, and maybe we'll see you again in fall when I'm teaching something not intro, hopefully. Take care.